In this video, I'm going to be talking about the three benchmarks of a democratic form of government. And what I mean by a benchmark is a standard by which you measure something. And so I'm going to be talking about democracy sort of in its ideal form, the way it's supposed to work ideally. And I'll make some comments about where I think the country is in terms of our democratic form of government. You may not agree with me, and that's perfectly fine. But probably right now, you're not going to have a whole lot of information on some of these topics. That's what we're going to be covering over the course of the class. And so I'll be revisiting these concepts as we go through the class. So first, what do I mean by popular sovereignty? The idea behind popular sovereignty is that the people in a democracy are the ultimate source of government authority. That the government, as we'll talk about later on, and we talk about our Constitution in the next video, the idea behind the Declaration of Independence and our founding documents is that government was created to protect the rights of the people, what are referred to as the inalienable rights of people, rights given to us by God. But ultimately, we are the authority. We each, as citizens, possess political authority, the right to rule. And that's what makes democracy different than authoritarianism or totalitarianism. But there are 6 conditions that sort of have to exist in order to maintain popular sovereignty. First, the government's policies have to reflect the preferences of the majority. Now, this is actually a little more complicated than it sounds, because the framers of the Constitution, as you'll find out, were very concerned about the majority having too much power. They weren't really trusting of the majority, and they were worried that sometimes the majority will advance its interests at the expense of the minority. And so in any democracy, while the policies of the government are supposed to reflect the preferences of the majority, they're supposed to reflect the preferences as long as they don't impinge on or hurt the rights of the minority. And at the same time, governmental policies are supposed to reflect the preferences of the majority over time. In other words, if the majority wants policy A at one moment, and then 2 years later they change their mind and they want policy B, and then 3 years later they go back to wanting policy A, the government isn't supposed to shift back and forth in terms of policies. That governmental policies are supposed to reflect the majority's preferences over time, what we'll call stable preferences over time. Second, our government leaders need to be selected in competitive elections. And we certainly have competitive elections. But one thing I want to remind you about now, and have you think about now, is that there are a whole bunch of government leaders that you don't vote for, that we don't vote for. For example, for those of you who voted in the last election, who did you vote for Supreme Court? Right? You didn't vote for Supreme Court. That's not on the ballot. Right? Of late, since the pandemic started, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has been a really important body, making a lot of significant decisions along with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Well, who did you vote for to head the CDC? Who did you vote for to head the FDA? You didn't. I didn't. There are a whole bunch of really powerful people who aren't elected, but they get their positions from people who are elected. For example, the Supreme Court. The justices on the Supreme Court are nominated by the president, who is elected, and approved by the Senate, who are elected. And so there is some accountability. So it's important to keep in mind that not all our leaders are elected in competitive elections, but we have the ability to hold our leaders accountable if they put someone in one of those positions who's doing a terrible job. Next, elections need to be free, fair, and there's one other thing. I call them 3 F's. I'm going to let you think about what the third F is while I talk about the other ones. Now, when I say free, there can be no coercion of voters. Voters have to be able to go and vote without any impediments whatsoever. Now, as I'm sure you know from your American history, that has not always been the case, right? One of the things that we're going to be talking about as we talk about some issues pertaining to voting is there were a variety of methods that were used once the 15th Amendment was passed and the government was not allowed to restrict voting on the basis of race, that in the South, all kinds of other policies were adopted that didn't stop people from voting because they couldn't do that. That was unconstitutional. What they did is they prevented people from registering to vote. And that's how they got around that. So in our elections, there can't be any coercion of voters. Second, the elections need to be fair. That is, the rules cannot favor one set of candidates over another. If they're rigged, as the expression is used frequently, that's not an election that's going to function properly. Now, I want to be clear about this. I know that in the 2020 elections, there were all kinds of allegations of voter fraud. As of the recording today, it's December 30th, 2021. There is absolutely no evidence of large-scale voter fraud, and that has been true for the last 20 years. There is no widespread voter fraud. The system in place has been very effective. I remember there was a point at which during the 2020 election, and depending on when you're watching this could be a long time ago, President Trump at the time said that 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia. Actually, what turned out to happen is that 4 dead people voted. What happened is they actually cast their ballots. Their absentee ballots died, and somebody brought them in and submitted their ballots. 4 people, dead people voted, not 5,000. Voter fraud is a myth, and we'll talk about this later on. What's the third F? Did you come up with it? Free, fair, and frequent. Right? It doesn't do any good to have an election, let's say in 1980, and then have another one in 2000, another one in 2020, right? They have to be frequent. And in that respect, the United States does a really good job, maybe even too good of a job. We have elections for the House of Representatives every 2 years. We also vote for senators. Every 4 years, we vote for presidents. We have statewide elections. There are some political scientists who say that we have so many elections that voters sometimes suffer from voter fatigue. There's just too many elections when you take citywide elections, statewide elections, and then national elections. So I'm going to stop there, and in the next video, we'll continue on with this section.